Hi, Eleanor.
Hello,
Um,
Peter.
my guest today is former film studies and Italian lecturer from University of Wolverhampton, Dr. Eleanor Andrews. Thanks so much, Eleanor, for talking with me.
You're welcome.
So I wanted to first ask you how you began your career teaching film studies.
Well, I've always loved the cinema, and I used to go a lot with my parents, even when I was small. But I started my career as a languages teacher, teaching French and Italian, and that went on for quite a while. And I even started an Italian studies degree in which there was a module on Italian cinema. But unfortunately, the market sort of dropped out of languages. I don't quite know why, and people weren't doing them at university anymore. And I'd just taken my MA in Italian cinema at Red, and I asked the leader of film studies, Ken Page, if I could join his team because I couldn't really see any future in teaching languages. I still taught them a little bit, but not nearly so much. And so in 1998, I joined the film studies team at Wolverhampton, and it was a bit of a baptism of fire because obviously I had to sort of learn as I was teaching, which, which is often quite a good thing to do. And then as I progressed, I decided that I wanted to do a PhD in um, in cinema, and Reading was the obvious place to go because they knew me. And I had my supervisor was Christopher, who's a specialist in Italian cinema. Um, so that's how it really started. And as I taught some of the basic things like film history, but I also had a love of French cinema as well. So those were my two specialisms, French and Italian. And I taught them right up until I retired 2.5 years ago.
Tell me about your love of Italian cinema.
Well, that really started when I was working with Chris Wagstaff. He was very generous with, in those days, it was videos. And I was doing the MA part time, and I used to go down on a Monday, and I'd have a tutorial in the morning, and then I would watch something at lunchtime on a video, and then I'd have another tutorial in the afternoon. And when I left in the afternoon, I would leave with a whole bag of videos that he would lend me, which was very generous. Um, and so we did all things to do with Italian cinema. We started off with Bernardo Bertolucci, and I watched all of Bertolucci's films. I couldn't let my children, who were quite small, I couldn't let them see many of the films because some of them are a bit X-rated, shall we say. Um, and then, so we had a whole term on Bertolucci, which was very interesting. And then we had a term on spaghetti westerns. And I've always loved westerns. It's been something I've loved, but I'd never really watched the spaghettis. And so I had dozens. And literally, they were the good, the bad, and the ugly, because the bad ones were very, very bad. But I saw a lot of them. And I also saw a lot of neo-realist films. So for people who perhaps don't know, that those are the films um, which were filmed just after the Second World War, and they deal with the war and what was happening in Italy during the war and subsequently. Um, so I just loved watching these films, and I think the more of a particular type of film you watch, the more influences you see, and the more you also see of links with other cinemas. And the French and Italian cinema world have always been very closely allied, um, with people working as assistant director, for example, on films in the two different countries. Um, so that's really how that started. And I always enjoyed the films of Nanni Moretti, and I decided that I would do my PhD on his films. Um, it wasn't a popular choice with my supervisor. He wasn't a fan of Nanni Moretti, but I don't know whether I ever persuaded him. Initially, I was going to do some work on comedy, and I even worked out a framework for comedy, which I was quite pleased with, because being a linguist, I quite like to order things. Um, but my supervisor didn't think that he thought it was too big a job to do that for a PhD. So I went through all sorts of different stages, looking at authorship, for example, looking at narrative structure. And I ended up with using narratives. And that's what I did my PhD on. And the PhD eventually turned into a book, which was about the narrative space in Moretti's works.
And have you watched many films now since retirement?
Oh, yes. Yeah. We're very lucky. I live in a small town in Shropshire in England, and we still have a cinema. It's a lovely 1930s cinema, which has now been converted into, it's got two small cinemas upstairs. So it's 5 minutes walk from my house. So we go a lot. And also in a nearby town, Shrewsbury, there's a lovely old cinema, well, a new cinema in a very old building. So there's a very, very old, I think it dates back to the 17th century. And in there, they've built a lovely coffee bar and a tiny cinema. There's about 70 seats in it. And before COVID, about once a month, I would go there with an ex-colleague, Stella Hockenhull, and we'd have lunch, and then we'd go and watch a film in that very, very nice, very intimate cinema there. And so I've seen a lot of films since I've retired. I've made a little bit of a list. That I tend to like feel-good films, where when you can watch whatever you like. So I watch things like Emma and Fisherman's Friend and David Copperfield, the new David Copperfield. But I also saw the Spanish film Pain and Glory. I saw Parasite. Now, Parasite was fabulous. Not the sort of film I would have expected to see. I might have studied it, but to watch it for pleasure. I saw If Beale Street Could Talk, which was very interesting. And Stella and I both said if we were teaching, we'd definitely put that back onto the representation module. But I also saw things like Mary Poppins Returns and Paddington 2. So it was a whole load of different films. And then during the lockdown period, BBC television put on a lot of classic films. They put on a lot of musicals and a lot of classic westerns. And so we just watched them. It was great. It was usually a Thursday evening, so it was perfect, 8 till 10. And we watch things like Bringing Up Baby and Singing in the Rain. And I don't know, Citizen Kane's been on recently. So all those classic things. But of course, nowadays, television itself, which is not a medium I've particularly studied, but television has got some fabulous made for television films as well on things like Netflix and Amazon Prime. So there's not quite enough hours in the day really to see all these things that you really like to see.
And also, you did some modules on French cinema. Wondered if you had favorite French directors that you studied over the time.
Yeah, well, when I started, there were two French modules. There was one which was about the 1930s. It's a period called poetic realism. So the films are based in reality, in that they're about working class people, but there's a sort of a poetic, lyrical look to them. And then the second module was mostly about French New Wave. The two modules became joined together later when we wanted to introduce new things. But I've always loved those particular periods. And there are three particular directors from, for example, the poetic realist period. One is Jean Renoir, And some of the films, I think my favorite film of his is La Grande Illusion, which is an anti-war film about the First World War. It's a strange film to say it's a war film because you never see any combat. It's very much an anti-war film, but it's also about relationships between classes and how the class relationship can often be stronger than a national relationship. Um, and you have at least two examples of that. You have the officer class within the film are much closer together than the lower ranks. And also you have, towards the end of the film, you have the ordinary French soldiers meeting with an ordinary German peasant woman and realizing that they've got things in common, even though they're on opposite sides. So I really liked La Grande Illusion. I also liked Le Crime de Monsieur Lange, Monsieur Lange's Crime, which is it's a very interesting film because it has a circular motif, both in the narrative, but also in the visuals. There's a lot of circularity. The camera moves in a circular way. There are a lot of circular objects within the mise en scène. And the story starts at the end, goes back to the beginning, and then comes back to the end. So it's about a crime. There's no sort of spoilers there. You're told that right from the title of the film. But I like that film, and I also, one of his films, which was a bit similar to Italian neorealism, was a film called Tony, which was about Italian immigrants in France in the 1930s. And he used people who are not professional actors and actresses to fill the roles. So that was really interesting. So he's one, his so-called masterpiece, The Rules of the Game, I like it a little less than the others. I, I feel that it sort of, for me, it didn't have a satisfactory conclusion, but that was a personal taste. And another director from this period that I liked was Marcel Carné. I think possibly my favorite film of this period completely is Le Jour se lève. In English, it's called Daybreak. And it's another film which starts at the end and goes back to the beginning. And it's about a man who's committed a murder and about what brings him. And it's a beautifully crafted film in 3 parts. It's got the flashbacks are very carefully signaled, and it's got a star in it who is my favorite star of this period, Jean Gabin. Jean Gabin was in so many films in the 1930s. So I absolutely love that film. But Marcel Carné, after the war, made another very famous film called Les Enfants du Paradis, the Children of Paradise. Paradise meaning the upper balcony of a theatre, what in English we call the gods. I don't know whether you use that expression in Ireland. And it's about the theatre. And it is a wonderful film. And it was made after the war, because although French cinema existed during the Second World War, it was very, very heavily under the Nazi control. So there were very few films that were made that had any sort of freedom. But once the war was over, Carnet made Les Enfants du Paradis. And the third director from this period that I really like is Julien Duvivier. Now, if you read books about French cinema, you won't find a whole chapter on Duvivier. He wasn't considered an auteur, an author of his own work. He was considered what was called a metteur en scène, just a run-of-the-mill director. But I don't think that's true. I think some of the films he made were really, really interesting. And 2 films that he made that I really enjoyed. One was called Pepe le Moco, and this was a film set in Algiers. starring the famous Jean Gabin as a jewelry thief. And it it was a very interesting film. Again, about as much about class as it was about nationality. And another film that I enjoyed was it was called La Belle Équipe in French, but in English, the title is They Were Five, and it's about five working class men who win the lottery and what happens to them. And as I said at the very beginning of talking about these French films, they were in a period of poetic realism, but hand in hand with that, there was a political movement called the Popular Front, which was a left-wing movement. And it had a very optimistic beginning in which the ordinary people were given long holidays. They were told to drink milk. They were told to wash their bed sheets and their clothes, to have a healthy lifestyle. But then there was a second part as the Second World War was looming. And what is interesting about La Belle Équipe is that it really does reflect both the optimistic side of the Popular Front, but also the anxious, the worried section. And it was a film where poor Julien Duvivier had to make two endings. When the previews of the original ending, which was rather downbeat, went out, people said, well, you'll never sell this to America. You know, it hasn't got a happy ending. You're going to have to do something. So he did happy ending. Mine found the happy ending online and showed it to me so I could then show it to my students. So with a little twist of the editing, and it was only a little twist, Duvivier managed to make a happy ending when, you know, the characters didn't come to blows, shall we say. So those are my three favourite directors from that period, the 1930s. And I think from the new wave, which was the 1960s, where the camera was lighter, the sound equipment was lighter, and the directors could go out onto the streets and film not so well-known actors and actresses. I think my favourite director of that period is François Truffaut. And probably my favourite film of his is Les 400 coups, the 400 blows, which is the story of a schoolboy. And he's not a bad boy, but he gets into bad situations. And it's about what happens to him. And it's a lovely film. It's got beautiful soundtrack and very interesting cinematography. All the interior scenes are very claustrophobic, very static camera, and people crowded round tables or crowded into interiors. And this sort of signifying how stifling his home life was, this boy. But when he's out with his friend, and all the outside shots are very free and open, and the camera moves freely, again signifying how different he felt. And it's got a wonderful last, I would dare to say 4 or 5 minutes, when the boy, having been put into a sort of a prison, escapes, and he runs towards the sea. And you have this wonderful tracking shot of him running, and he gets to the sea, and you're questioning, what on earth is he going to do? You know, is he going to commit suicide or anything dreadful? But no, he just runs into the sea, and then he turns, he looks straight into the camera, and Truffaut has a freeze frame. And it's a wonderful ending to quite a moving film. So those are, I think Truffaut's definitely my favourite from that period. But I have seen a lot of modern French films. I think there's a film, and of course the title has now escaped me, but it's about it doesn't sound terribly promising. It's about a quadriplegic and an African guy who's brought in to look after them. Can you remember the title at all?
It's not the Intouchables. Untouchable.
That's it.
Yeah, yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
That's it. Yes, thank you. So I showed that to students, and they actually laughed out loud. So it doesn't promising, but it's a very funny film. And just recently on the television, I saw a film which was called, in French, it was called Aurore, which is the name of the main character. And again, it doesn't sound promising. It's about a woman going through the menopause, but it was actually hilarious. And my husband and I were roaring with laughter. And the French are continuing to make, they've still got a very strong film industry, and they're continuing to make brilliant films and TV things. I don't know whether you've ever seen the TV program Spiral,
No, actually, I
the,
did
the
not.
police the police thing. It's very gritty. It's quite bloodthirsty, and they don't spare your imagination on anything. But it's very good, and we've watched. It started in 2005, and we've been watching it, ever since, really.
I wanted to ask you about your career teaching and writing as well, and how you found that over the years, and I suppose time management as well.
Right. Well, obviously, teaching languages and teaching film studies were two absolutely completely different things. Teaching languages, you're in constant dialogue with the students, and they don't write essays, they do exercises and things. So going over to film studies, which was lecture, film, seminar, was very different for me. But I did enjoy it. I enjoyed watching the films prior to teaching them. I enjoyed the whole thing. And I particularly enjoyed the seminars, because every year I could be teaching the same film for many years, and the students would always come up with something new. Um, one of the things I did, which was quite early on, was to use overhead projectors. And I probably don't even know whether your listeners will even know what those are, but it was a form of projecting where you could write on a transparency and it would be projected up. So as part of the seminar, I would get the students to write their answers down on these transparencies, and then we would share them with the whole group. And I got some amazing answers from there. But it was difficult to find time to do research. When I did my MA, I was teaching full time. That was a very, very tricky year. It was still tricky when I did my PhD, but less so because it was spread out over several years. Writing was always a difficult thing to find, not just a couple of hours, because you need a couple of days. You need to get in the zone, and you need to blank everything else out and then get on with it. So that was quite difficult. I did have a sabbatical during the last few years that I was teaching. It was useful, but then you've got this terrible guilt complex, because if you weren't actually at the computer typing, you sort of thought that you should be. So I don't know, that we didn't do my mental health a deal of good, I don't think, doing that. I always enjoyed doing the research, finding things out, finding out what was that song, why did they use that particular color, how did they do that particular shot, what was that special effect. I found actually writing more difficult, and I had as what I used to call a patchwork quilt approach to it. So I would write bits, and it was only towards the end that I would bring it all together. Now, my colleague that I mentioned earlier, Stella Hockenheld, had a completely different approach. She would start at the beginning and she would go on right to the end. And I could never do that. I wish I could, but I had this this patchwork quilt effect. And when it was interesting, because I discovered that Nanni Moretti also had a very similar way of working when he was making his film. So I felt justified in not being able to start and just carry on. I loved reading about things. I always used to feel ever so slightly guilty if I'd say, oh, I've got to do some reading on something, and I would have a whole load of, I've got all these little post-it things, you know, that you stick into books. And or you can tell the books I've read because they're full of these little post-it things sticking out. But it was tough, and then of course twice a year you'd get a whole load of essays in, and I think anybody who's a teacher will tell you that marking is possibly the least favorite bit of your. I mean, I loved connecting with the students. I love prepping things, but marking was hard. It was real hard work. Um, Marking things like presentations was much more interesting, and also because when you did presentations, you would often do them live with another colleague, and afterwards you'd compare notes. So it was more time efficient, I think. Whereas doing essays, and then you do it, and then you'd have to um, give all the essays to your colleague, and then they would sample them, and then they would second mark those ones, and you'd have to do the same. So that was, yeah, that was the least favorite bit of my teaching, I think, doing the marking.
And what about the thinking about the notion of the desire to write about a film versus the desire to make it? I don't know if you've any comments on that.
Well, I've never made a film. Um, I I think if I were younger, I might think about it. But having studied film, knowing how complex it could be, I don't know. That doesn't mean to say I wouldn't like to take part in a film if anyone wants any extras. I do actually do musical theatre as a hobby. So I'm in the chorus of musical theatre. So I do have a tiny bit of acting experience. Um, but I've never made a film. I'm always very impressed. I've got a number of ex-students who I'm still in contact with, and several of them have made films, and several of them have been actually quite successful in making films. Um, we always like to have students who did that crossover. We didn't get many of them. We did try once to start a joint degree where it was literally half film studies and half film production. But in my experience of that was that most students wanted to do either one thing or the other. And I didn't find a whole bunch of them who wanted to do a bit of both. Um, so we used to have people from the production, typically 2 or 3 a year, would join us in film studies. And similarly, 2 or 3 people from film studies would say, no, sorry, this isn't for me. I want to actually be hands-on. And they would go over to the film production. We worked closely with the film production people, and I'm still in contact with several of them. Um, and it was really interesting to go to some of their lectures because they saw things from obviously a different point of view. I really loved going to the ones about how to write a script or a screenplay. That was fascinating because it was very different from writing an essay or writing an article, um, and having to consider, you know, what the lighting might be, or if there was going to be background music and things like that. So, yeah, so I've never made a film. I might want to make a film if I was a bit younger. And of course, the other thing is nowadays with people's phones, you know, you can make a film with a phone, which is incredible, really. You don't have to have a huge load of equipment. So I think it's very optimistic for people who want to make films. The only thing I would say is people would come to see me towards the end of their film studies career and say, I want to go into production now. I want to go to such and such a university. And I would say to them, where is your show reel? Where, you know, where are the films that you've made? And they say, well, I haven't done any yet. And I say, you can't go to an interview and say, well, I haven't made any films yet. I want to make some. If you want to make films, I used to say to the first years, start now. Start your films right at the beginning, no matter how basic they are or how much you don't, you know, relish the thought of them years later. I mean, Bertolucci, his first film, rather horribly, was about killing a pig. I mean, you know, that doesn't leave much to the imagination, but you can make a much better film than that if you wanted to. So I would say to people, if you want to make films, do it. Go. You don't have to have fancy equipment. Take your phone out onto the streets with permission, of course, of people, and make a film.
Any thoughts on the university perspectives on theories or how that worked in Wolverhampton?
Okay, so I had quite a few colleagues who were very keen on theory. Thank goodness, because I wasn't. I wanted to look at the film as an artifact and see how it was put together. I suppose that's really constructivism, the Bordwell idea. Although I didn't know it at the time, it was only later that I realized that. And a lot of those early film theories, interestingly enough, came from the study of linguistics and breaking everything down. So you have people like Christian Metz breaking things down into tiny little pieces, which you end up with the shot, and using those as sort of like punctuation. I wasn't, I must say, wholly convinced by that. Um, but there are interesting film theories. One that a lot of my colleagues would use was psychoanalysis, particularly things like the mirror theory by Jacques Lacan. Um, Again, I don't know how convinced I was by all that. Um, I was interested in comparing films to dreams. So I could see that Freud and Jung would come into that aspect of things, but I wasn't totally convinced by the psychoanalysis. One of my colleagues, Dr. Fran Pheasant Kelly, wrote a great deal about the concept of abjection, and particularly the works of Julia Kristeva. And again, it was something which I got a huge amount about, but I mean, maybe you'd be able to interview her if you haven't already interviewed her. I'm sure she'd like to talk about that sort of aspect. Um, so there was a lot of theory being taught at Wolverhampton, but I wouldn't say that it was being taught particularly in my modules. So we had modules on authorship and modules on representation, for example, where a lot of these theories were incorporated. And in the master's degree, I know that a huge amount of these different theories were brought in. But if you were doing work with me, I didn't say, I don't want to know anything about theory. I would say, yeah, do theory if you want to. And I'm interested if you bring it into your essays, but don't expect me to be doing a huge amount of teaching of that. I want to look at the film. I want to break the film down into, I suppose, into sequences and shots, but not maybe label them as such. But having said that, of course, as I said a few moments ago, I was interested in looking at comedy and really trying to break down. I took 2 or 3 sequences from the Moretti film Caro Diario, Dear Diary, and they were shots of about, sorry, there were sequences of about 3 or 4 minutes, and I broke them up into different um, comic aspects. I forget what I called them now, it's a while ago. And it took a very long time, 3 minutes on the screen, hours and hours in the analysis. So perhaps my supervisor was right. If I'd done, I think by the time I did my PhD, I think he'd done 9 or 10 films. So 9 or 10 films times 90 minutes, it would have taken a long time, because comedy is one of the aspects of Moretti's films. It's not the only thing, but it's one of the aspects. And I've done a couple of conference papers on comedy, which have gone down quite well. But again, only doing tiny little sequences. So I suppose a bit of me is interested in theory, but not a great deal.
one final thing. Is there a favorite Moretti film?
I think I like The Sun's Room, La Stanza del Figlio best. It was slightly different from his other films because it didn't have a huge amount of comedy. It was actually a tragedy. And I would show that um, to the students alongside the Pedro Almodovar's film about my mother, which I'm sure you know as well,
Yeah.
is also a tragedy. And I would show, and I think I also showed them the Polish film Three Colors Blue. It's French, it's in French, but by Kozlowski. And I would compare those three films, which dealt with tragedy, personal, and how they dealt with them. So I think, but the earlier Moretti films are slightly more off the wall. He got more, dare I say, conventional as he's got older. And he's got a film coming out. I think it's going into cinemas in Italy in September, but I'm not entirely sure. In Italian, it's called Tre Piani, which is 3 floors of an apartment block, which is very typical, of course, in Italy. Also interesting because apartments feature very often in Italian films. It's one of those things. So I look forward to that. I don't know when it'll come out. I don't know when I should get to Italy again. Obviously not been to Italy for a while. And of course, there's still a lot of restrictions. They've had a lot of problems over there as we have in Britain. So yeah, so I think The Sun's Room is probably my favourite. And again, it's a beautifully orchestrated film in the way different pieces come in. And it's also got a lot of very interesting they're not dream sequences, it's they're sort of daydreaming when the main character is thinking about his son, which I think are interesting. But if for recommendations, a very accessible one is Dear Diary. That is actually quite funny. And I also like We Have a Pope, which is about a man who's made pope and then can't cope with it. And again, and I should say, I have actually stood right next door to Moretti. I went to a retrospective at the Cinematheque in Paris in 2011, I think it was. And he was there and he gave some very interesting talks. And during one of the intervals, he was out having a coffee, and there I was. And I did get his autograph, but I was upset. I couldn't say anything more, either in English, French, or Italian. I was dumbstruck. So I, just asked for his autograph. But it was a very good retrospective. And one of his trademarks is the Austrian cake, the Sackertorte, which is a chocolate cake, which he loves apparently. And in the middle of all this, a student brought out a Sackertorte. And because it's Moretti, he didn't just say, oh, grazie. He took it and went and started eating. So, yeah. And of course, his film company is called La Sacher. And his cinema in Rome, which I've never been to, sadly, is called Il Nuovo Sacher. So that's his trademark, the Austrian chocolate cake.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, Eleanor, thanks so much for talking with me.
It's been lovely I haven't talked so much about film for 2.5 years, so it's great. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about them.